Welcome to the Texas Psychologist. I'm Dr. John Dolatorre, and here's a snippet from today's session. So, yes, we could talk
Yeah,
about
I've
Ellen
listened to,
Greenberg.
thanks to Mac, I've listened to, see, I told you not to meow. I've listened to,
That's the intro, by the way. Thank you, everybody, for joining the Texas Psychologist podcast. I'm your host, Dr. John Dolatorre. This episode's going to look a little bit different. There was some technical issues that happened, so we had to kind of make some on-the-fly transitions. But today's episode is known as a peer review episode. So I was joined by Dr. McKenna Hereford. You can find her on social media on Revealing the Ivory Tower podcast, and Dr. Lina Haji. You can find her on social media at rise underscore psychological underscore services. We were talking about three different cases. The first case was of Ellen Greenberg, who many are concerned about the medical exams that had occurred. Lina, Mac, and I discussed, what could compel someone to engage in these behaviors, but more importantly, why what is it exactly about what was going on with the medical examination team that would lead them to make the decisions that they made without truly showing their work, showing why they believe these behaviors were self-inflicted. The next story was the Netflix documentary Evil Influencer, the Jodi Hildebrandt story. The three of us discussed kind of the ins and outs of what exactly would lead to these two, Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt, to engage in the behaviors that they ultimately engaged in. What were the underlying psychological issues at play, and what to kind of look out for when it comes to power dynamics in any relationship. And then our final story to talk about was a Wondery podcast from American Scandal, FBI agent turned Russian spy. This is the story of Robert Hansen and the decades-long spying that he did for the Soviet Union while as a member of the FBI, including some interesting kind of ancillary behaviors when it comes to overall sexual deviancy and those behaviors that he did in violation of his wife. Again, thank you for watching. I hope you liked the episode. Again, we'll work out the technical issues as we move forward. Thank you. So, okay. So, what else is everybody watching, listening to, whatever, reading?
Oh,
Do
should
we
we
all
talk about Ellen Greenberg?
Oh,
we can talk about Ellen Greenberg. Sure. Yeah.
I mean, to
We'll
the
talk about that.
limited, I guess. I know we're not investigators or whatever, but that was the first one that came to mind. I feel like I've watched so many true crime things. The moment you asked me, my mind went blank.
no, Ellen
Well,
Greenberg
yeah.
is
Yeah.
good. Fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. One of the topics I was going to do for the solo element of the podcast was going to be about psychological autopsies, because we've had kind of a rash of especially young women engage in pretty kind of violent acts of self-harm. And it's like, are you sure they did this just by themselves? It doesn't really quite seem. One set herself on fire. One threw herself off a ten
Oh, in
foot
San
building.
Antonio.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's like, I don't. None of this sounds like right as just a thing. So yes, we could talk
Yeah,
about
I've
Ellen
listened to,
Greenberg.
thanks to Mac, I've listened to, see, I told you not to meow. I've listened to,
That's the intro, by the way.
FBI profiler, the consult, Mac, FBI profiler, the prosecutors, and because I'm unwell, and the detectives do Ellen Greenberg. And every single, whether it's a profiler, a prosecutor, or an investigator, none of them believe it was suicide. None of them. And none.
Well, I think that's a good kind of starting point of how can all of these different professionals all assume one act kind of occurred, but then the ultimate authority, which should be the medical examiner, has twice now uh, kind of said that no, that this was a self-inflicted act. Why do we think that's real?
But did you catch that the independent second opinion was not actually independent, and it was a review by the same office of the first analysis? It wasn't an independent medical review. There was a built-in bias. It was the same office.
Yeah,
And it wasn't redone. It was a review, from what I understand.
Yes, which if I was that family and this was the outcome of a civil trial, I would be raging. Just from the optics, you'd think that they'd want to get an outside person, even if there isn't any, just for the optics
Mm.
alone and the way that the report sounded. There were a lot of leaps in judgment being made, and it came across because I said that this thing is true without actually explaining how these things, where's the evidence to kind of suggest how did we land to this particular summary or judgment, clinical judgment that you're making in this particular paragraph or section, and then ultimately at the end of this. I think a lot of people can understand why it would be difficult to rule homicide just based on how horribly inadequately it was investigated. They've lost a lot of evidence. At the very least, it doesn't seem you can say with confidence that it's suicide. That new report, obviously, I'm not a medical examiner. I'm not even a forensic psychologist. I have some medical knowledge, so in some ways, I'm kind of like the layperson reading through this, and it still didn't really answer a lot of these questions. It just basically said, "Oh yeah, because I said that this thing is true."
Well, why do you think that why do you think there's such a hesitation, uh, Lena and Mac? Why do you think that there's such a hesitation to kind of not so much backtrack, but say, wait a minute, I made a mistake, and clearly looking back on the examination that was done, there was some interpretation errors. What do you think is kind of holding the person back from saying, hey, look, taking a second look, my opinion's changed.
Well, just like McKenna said, we're not investigators, but it's well known that the investigation was botched, if you will, from the beginning. I mean, people walking around, nothing was secured, called it a suicide within the hour. So I think, and from what I understand, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, it was initially ruled a homicide, then switched to suicide. And as McKenna said, I don't understand the like push to not at least call it undetermined. I think everybody would be like, okay, undetermined, we can live with that. I think maybe too many people's reputations are on the line. The cops, the department, the prosecutors, the medical examiner's office. There's so many people on the line that will look bad. And I hope that's not it, but I can't come to any other conclusion. What do you guys think?
I think that's the more generous interpretation, frankly. I think some people might assume there's a conspiratorial aspect to this. I think the boyfriend, husband, initial suspect at the time, his uncle was a judge, right? And like came on the scene and even like went and gathered some evidence. That is wild. So I think in the nature of the times that we're in, it's easy for people to distrust different systems. And so I think I could see how some people would jump to the conclusion that there's some cover up of something. I think it's much more likely what you said, Lena, that it is very difficult to acknowledge as human beings when we've done something wrong. They don't really have to worry, I guess, about a civil law. This was the result of a civil lawsuit. So I don't really know what else would be at risk. I mean, maybe more finance. I'm not an attorney, obviously. Maybe John, like you can add more to that, but for sure, having to own that publicly can't feel very good.
Yeah, and but I think at a certain point as a professional, your feelings about your opinions needs to kind of be pushed to the side. It sucks to be wrong. Yes, it does suck to be wrong. It always sucks to be wrong. But if I go on the stand and I have to testify in a case about something and it's clear that my interpretation of what happened is in error, I have to sit in that discomfort and say, you know what? I'm wrong. Right. I just got this wrong. And I think it's it goes to the level of kind of insulation of the practice, whatever you're
Mhm.
practicing, that you're not able to say, I made him. I don't think that there's any way that using regular common sense. I don't think that there's any way in which you can interpret that she did all of these injuries to herself. A handful of injuries, sure. I mean, it's not out of the realm of possibility, but there are some injuries that she suffered that there's just no physical way that she could have done that. I mean, things would have had to have been set up in the space, in the environmental space, to create those injuries. But then you would see evidence in the physical space that the knife had been set up in a certain way for that injury. You know what I mean? Like if you're the only one there, then there shouldn't it shouldn't look staged, right? It should look like what actually happened, and the crime scene doesn't look like it was multiple people. um it doesn't look like someone had come in and kind of set everything up to just kind of make it seem like she did all these things. So I just I'm just concerned about where we are as a society when we can't even when even the professionals that we're supposed to trust are supposed to give us what's actual and factual can't tell us when they were human and they made an error.
Or explain that in the report, the new one. I'm with you on the injuries. I'm thinking that's probably unlikely, but maybe medically it's possible. That's who I would look to perhaps explain there's a medically possible way or physiologically for these to happen. And even in the report, they also mentioned this in the consult as well. We're all thinking very curiously. I mean, maybe there is a medical explanation. That wasn't explained actually. It just basically said, oh, it essentially probably didn't paralyze her, but it didn't explain how we know that or referenced anything that would indicate that or anatomically, structurally, whatever that may. Again, it was like we're kind of jumping to a conclusion and maybe that's a valid conclusion, but we weren't really led there. There wasn't an explanation of how we got to this conclusion, whereas both of you might, if you're on the stand, okay, you have conclusions of what likely is the case. You kind of have to walk everyone through, and I would think in this case, especially when there's a civil lawsuit and you're really having to now review something that's already been done. The goal then, I would think, is to come in with fresh eyes and fill in the blanks. Maybe there are blanks. Those blanks just were not filled in from what I understand. To me anyway, just as a curious person that is not a physician.
Yeah, there is an element of having to show your work in a forensic process, right? It's easy, I think, in a clinical process to kind of have all of your the work that you do, right? Your whatever your theoretical orientation is and your conceptualization of the case is fairly easy for it to kind of be internal and never documented. but it's a lot harder to do in a forensic case. And I'm not just talking about forensic psychology case. I mean, DNA and ballistics and everything like that. Like everything that you have to do for court, uh, you have to demonstrate how you got there, right? That's part of the standards of the science that the judge is supposed to gatekeep, which is you have to demonstrate how it's being used. You can't just say ipse dixit, because I said so. Um, but it's just I think this also leads to an interesting topic that has been approached to psychologists, which is that of the psychological autopsy. Which, for those that don't know, right, for those of you on the audience that don't know, psychological autopsy occurs after someone has committed an act of suicide, and you explore what were the behavioral markers that were present that would suggest that someone actually did engage in that behavior. And I'm wondering, Lena, Mac, have you guys ever done a psychological autopsy before?
So I've assisted in a couple with suicides in prison. It's not my area of expertise, but I think even having general clinical knowledge is helpful when you, and I agree, I think a psychological autopsy, because, okay, from our perspective, we don't know if the stab wound to the back of the neck, we don't know because they didn't, like McKenna said, they didn't clarify that. Did it paralyze or did it not? Were there, all that kind of stuff. But from a psychological perspective, there seems to have been some kind of future oriented thought process. My understanding was she had recently filled up her gas tank, which is, again, one minor detail that doesn't mean a whole lot. But in conjunction with that, she was worried about her work, her students getting the grades in on time. Apparently, she was making a fruit salad. You put all these puzzle pieces together when you do a psychological autopsy, and it's like a circumstantial case. I think, the more circumstantial evidence you have, the more it points to a certain hypothesis. And from what I can tell, she did have a very future oriented thought process. Does that mean she didn't all of a sudden impulsively decide to take her life or have a psychotic break? We don't know. But that to me says there's a lot of doubt.
Yeah. I think there were maybe a couple internet searches maybe related to suicide. I also think in the age of the internet, I wouldn't necessarily put as much weight into that the medical examiner did. That was another kind of source of we're zooming in and providing a lot of detail on these other areas, and then we're just kind of skimming over these other areas, kind of depending on seemingly the conclusion that this person may have been foreclosed on, or perhaps just for blind spots. Maybe that was not conscious at all, but this was another one of, oh, well, I think she had started a new medication. There were some searches online, and I've never done a psychological autopsy. As a clinical psychologist, and even just again, as a layperson in general, I'm reading this and I'm thinking, I mean, how many people have looked that up? Are we a pathologist? How do we know what was going on with the medicate? There's so many why, how questions that, again, were not answered. And so I think it would have been helpful and interesting for, and I don't know how this would work. Maybe John, Lena, you can explain this. Would this be something where they link up with an ME or, provide a separate report? Because I could see how we kind of need both. There was also apparently, reportedly, in the ME report, a lot of bruising that was just glossed over and not explained. And then I think the ME said something like, because there were no reports of abuse, that means there is no abuse. So over here, it's the absence of evidence. I guess we're assuming that that's the case, but it's interesting because if we're looking at signs of suicide, we're just going to skip over any bruising, but we're going to look at these couple internet searches and put a lot of weight into that. So all that to say, I do think this would be a great case to have some kind of collaboration or whatever that looks like, to have a psychological autopsy to try to perhaps fill in some blanks, or who knows, like reinforce an undetermined finding.
And I could be wrong, but I think the bruises were at various stages of healing.
Yes.
And also, how many domestic abusers don't report anything? I mean,
Well, maybe she played around with the kids on the playground. Maybe, again,
maybe.
we don't know. There
Yeah.
was nothing mentioned.
Yeah, as conducting a psychological autopsy, I've done a handful of them. It's not really something that I get too far into the weeds in terms of doing these as part of my practice, but they are relatively complex because you are trying to predict an outcome of behavior based on the limited amount of previous behaviors that you have access to, right? Documented evidence of behaviors that has occurred. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions in terms of psychology that kind of perpetuates and it still exists is this idea of, well, past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. That's not a complete sentence. It is the best predictor of future behavior is recent past behavior, right?
Mm.
And so just because someone at one point at some time thought about self-harm doesn't necessarily mean that they're
Mm.
automatically going to engage in an act of self-harm. And just because someone has not reported uh, a violent act that has been committed against them doesn't mean that a violent acts have not been committed against them. So I, there's so many things about a person's life that we don't know. We're not mind readers. We don't live in another person's shoes. Even our own clients, we're not there 24/7. We don't actually know what someone is doing every single hour of every single day, even though they're talking to us about it. Um, but it's a really hard thing to try to say, well, these are all the behaviors that we think contributed to these acts when you see the final act and you see just how gruesome and brutal it was. It's hard to imagine someone would want to do that to themselves even when they're in a place where making the ultimate decision to end their lives makes sense to them.
And not to oversimplify, but we all know that women don't tend to, not saying it can't happen and hasn't happened in the past, but women don't tend to take that route when ending their life. So that's another just small piece statistical research that you have to take into account. Which was it? I don't think so. How many, not even women, how many humans uh suicide by
Like
multiple
that. Yeah.
stabbings?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's super, super rare. So, and that was kind of glossed over also.
If even accounted for. I mean, we have base rate fallacies. We think about, something happens, fairly often or doesn't happen enough for some, like we have ideas about why people the amount of times people engage in particular behaviors, and the reality is that it's probably not that. It's just what we're being fed by the algorithm. I think we're always come back to what the algorithm is trying to tell us about something. Probably not that thing.
It is interesting that the conclusion is the least likely statistically. And I think we're all in agreement that that is possible.
Mhm.
We're we're just not seeing the evidence of how we arrived at at that conclusion. That's the part that we miss a lot of things that are zebras versus horse beats. And so it's
Yeah.
just very interesting that in this case, we jump to that conclusion that the least likely scenario is here. Certainly, is it possible that someone could have had some random psychosis or something like that? And I don't know, she's in the middle of a fruit salad and she decides to do this. How do how do we know that, first of all? And then how do we explain that? It seems like we're really fighting against the grain to come to
Mhm.
an atypical conclusion.
And and I think that what I think a lot of people are kind of latching themselves onto is why? What? It's okay if that's the actual answer, but why is it the answer? Why is it not something else? Like, right, like why is this the thing that is happening right now when to even, the lay person's eyes.
And I think that's where the psychological autopsy would be extremely helpful from a psychological, not medical perspective, because we would look at, okay, she was struggling with significant anxiety. She had a psychiatrist. She was on meds. We look at the mental health history, the developmental history, the substance abuse history, the relationship history. We look at all that stuff, which, an Emmy may not. And that's where, like you said, why? We still don't have a why if the correct conclusion is that this was self-inflicted. Like,
Why? Yeah.
let's do Hildebrandt.
You want to talk about Hildebrandt?
Look at McKenna's face.
All right. So the Netflix documentary Evil Influencer, right? It's on now to watch, and it's about Jody Hildebrandt, who I think, Lena, this was going to be your topic, right? So if you want to explain a little bit more about what you understand Jody Hildebrandt to be and her behaviors.
Sure, it's not like McKenna and I text each other about Jody Hildebrandt for months or anything. So Jody Hildebrandt, she was a therapist with a suspended license turned life coach, who primarily practiced in the Mormon community in Utah. And she found a way to align, maybe exploit and manipulate, we can discuss that, a very social media famous family, Ruby Frankie and her husband and children, who had over 2 million subscribers on a YouTube channel, kind of vlogging, documenting their very seemingly perfect life. And I think that Jody Hildebrandt, the reason I find Jody Hildebrandt interesting, and McKenna may disagree with me, is because I think it's not just she's a narcissistic psychopath. I think she's much more complex in terms of potential. Apparently, she had a history of trauma. I'm not excusing her behaviors, but she had a significant history of trauma. She had possibly some internalized homophobia that she struggled with towards herself, as she preached against the LGBTQ community. She was a pathological liar. She had a lot of the PCLR, psychopathy checklist traits. But there were some access to cluster B borderline stuff in there. At one point, McKenna and I were discussing, was she actually psychotically delusional? Did she really have these grandiose delusions of, I'm talking to God? Or was that more of the personality manipulation tactic? How much insight did she have? So that's why I find her interesting, because I think she's more multi-layered than just this manipulative cult leader type of deal. And the more I learn about her, the more I think that it's a lot. It's a lot. She's really multidimensional. I think she's exactly where she needs to be. I think she will likely continue to treat people in a very manipulative manner. And what she did was egregious. Watching that famous video of the kid knocking on the door still breaks my heart. But that's who Jody Hildebrandt is. And I find her more complex than just, the narcissistic psychopathic cult leader. I think she's more interesting than that. Maybe I'm wrong.
McKenna, is she wrong?
Begrudgingly, I'm agreeing with her against my will. I don't want to give this woman any more airtime, but it's true in these cases where there is someone that is kind of this cult-ish leader, or at least someone that exercises a large amount of control over a group. There does seem to be this intersection with grandiosity that comes up is kind of inevitable. But then to the level of detail, she also kind of vacillated between exercising a lot of power And then when she entered into the home, I mean, under the surface, this is still having some power, but it was, I'm unwell, I'm having these visions, I need to be taken care of. And now I am the person that is being cared for, as opposed to the person that is suggesting, treating, etc., other people, helping other people. I read Sherry Frankie's memoir, so Ruby Frankie's daughter. First of all, fantastic writer, and frankly, I think conceptualizes what's going on better than a lot of clinicians are able to. You can tell she spent a lot of time reading to cope when she was growing up. So she talks about this intersection of these two women who both kind of have similar traits. They look differently. That's the part that's actually really more complex to me, is you have these two parties that have similar grandiose types of traits. And in the Frankie family, it is interesting that mom has the more kind of dominant role, if you will. She's making more of the decisions, especially considering their faith and what that typically looks like. There's also then the momfluencer element to this and what that was like, that exploitation that comes up, which frankly, just seeing more and more about that is concerning, and the lack of legal rights that kids have compared to like child actors in these spaces. So there's that element. So there were already these high control, highly punitive practices in the home that bordered on probably a little sadistic in nature in terms of perhaps the motivation, wanting to punish and cause pain. Then the exploitation, media wise, and there's no privacy. Even if there's a private moment that I find really embarrassing, that's going to be advertised, that's monetized, etc. And then the kids are not really getting any money from that in a meaningful way. And then this new party comes in, and it's Hildebrand, who also is has a lot of these traits, but to Lina's point, I mean, seems to be more accomplished, more experienced at that in terms of preying on other people. She likely, I would assume, saw this family, the reach that they have. But then, of course, they're looking to her as the spiritual guiding person. What I didn't know until I read the memoir is the daughter, many people had raised red flags about this. And I guess we can maybe talk about this in a minute. There was this unique Utah law that also hindered her ability to be held accountable sooner. But they knew that her license was suspended. They knew, because they're kind of small town and culture, that even her own kids, Hildebrand's kids, like had gone no contact with her. And so this intersection of then how these two women get so intertwined and sort of feed off each other, where it's less clear cut. This person's preying on this person. Obviously, Hildebrand had a lot more power. It's interesting, though, that this particular mother was one of the victims of that, who also had inflicted a lot of harm onto others. Basically, to summarize all of that, that then is, there's this entanglement.
And I agree. The memoir was by the daughter was brilliant. McKenna had me read it, and I was resistant, and then I couldn't stop. And then there's also, Hildebrandt in the Hildebrandt documentary, which is different from the Ruby Frankie documentaries. They go into she admitted that she had control issues way before. She had an eating disorder. Not saying all eating disorders are a result of control issues, but that's how she conceptualized. I could control the sexual abuse as a child, the sexual abuse as an adolescent. Yeah, her kids had gone no contact. And then there was that other therapist who seemed to be genuinely caring and empathic and somewhat clinically savvy enough to help Hildebrandt's clients who had left her. Like, this had been going on for a long time. And so Ruby Frankie and Jody Hildebrandt were the perfect storm. And wow, what a storm.
Yeah, um, I think the more interesting element is this sort of uh, enmesh relationship that the two of them had. I think power dynamics are always kind of complex to really describe and to really kind of understand. For I think a lot of people just assume, well, this mom had, millions of viewers and was making a ton of money, so she has power. And then you have this, Jodi Hildebrand, who was this therapist, so she's educated and she's had all these experiences, has, you know, allegedly a lot of insight into kind of what trauma does to a person, and how to uh kind of work through. However, that for her it kind of just meant, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But what the how to overcome the trauma obstacles that are in your life, right? And who, if you were to just, kind of give one, if you were just to tell the audience, one person, and what those, right, all of those different things that they had, you would say, oh, well, that person is clearly the powerful one, right? She's the one
Mhm.
with all the viewers. She's the one with all the money. She's the one that's kind of the more famous one. Or oh, well, she's the one with the education, or she's the one with the like, how how does one how do two people with authority and agency decide who is going to play what role in a relationship, right? And I think that's kind of the starting point. What we find is that a because of a lot of the pressures that they were experiencing, it led them down paths that they probably would not have gone by themselves. Um, could Ruby Frankie have, like, developed more, intense parenting skills just over time, just because you have a lot of kids, and you get tired of all their nonsense. And so, like, could she have gone to extremes? Sure, though I doubt she would have gone as extreme if she didn't have an outside influence saying extremes are necessary in order to overcome trauma. And I think that was kind of the underlying message that Hildebrandt had, which is, it is only through pain that you can truly heal yourself, right? You have to experience more pain in order to, right, in a true Job type element, you'll have to experience more pain in order to come out the other side and be holy and righteous. You talk about, did Hildebrandt, like, truly believe that she was, God or the second coming or whoever it is? It's an interesting question, because I think, a lot of people kind of wonder, do crazy people know that they're crazy? The answer is yes, they do, right? That, I mean, that's kind of an element of, when we're looking at different things that people would say that are elements of crazy, right? Whether it's schizophrenia or major depressive disorder, right? Bipolar disorder, right? All these different things. These people know that what they believe is weird. They just can't stop it from happening. But then we have these other individuals like Jodi Hildebrandt who become true believers.
Mhm.
And when does it become an extreme overvalued belief versus a true delusion? I don't think she was delusional. I
Mhm.
think she
Mhm.
truly believed in her power, that she just assumed that she was more divine than what she actually was.
That's the hard part with, I think, the overlap with perhaps narcissism and these other pieces, because to your point, a lot of people, I'll see it on social media all the time. Oh, a narcissist knows blah, 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 blah. And it's like this very conscious, well thought out process. And I'm thinking, you're giving people a lot of credit.
Yeah.
To me, the question is, how conscious for Jodi was this thought process that, especially when she started moving into the home, she's isolating Ruby a lot more, getting a lot more control, getting the husband out, getting the older kids out. She wants Ruby all to herself. The way that that happens is she's unable to care for herself. She's having these
Mhm.
visions. They need to sleep in the same room. Then they have to move to a separate house, further isolating the family. My question is less about whether or not she believed the level of importance that she had in terms of like a spiritual element, which also she's choosing groups of people that already might have these social hierarchies in place, who trust these social hierarchies. And my question is more, how much did she consciously know that there was at least a side element of this of wanting to prey on this particular woman and her family separate from I am this very important person and like abusing the kids and the mom and all that stuff. That part, because there's an intersection there. I wonder about the consciousness there, or if the thought process was purely consciously whatever it was of like, this is what I'm experiencing, this is the support that I need, and was there no awareness at all? Was this all very egocentric, like aligned with her values? That's the part that we'll never know probably, but I'm curious about.
Yeah. I'll never think that your underlying motivations are never a part of your decision making. Then now, if we want to get like truly Freudian, right? We could talk about, well, she's just suppressing the negative ones. I have no doubt that um, there was a tiny little bit that said, I have power over this person. But that wasn't the thought that was in her head, right? You know what I mean? Like it was there and it was compelling the behaviors, but it wasn't the one rattling around. Like the true con man, right? Like they know that they're exploiting someone else, right? That's part of the game, right? I have to exploit, I have to get. I think she's just, I also don't want to say unaware because I think you're always aware, but that's again the existentialist. I mean, there's no real unconscious, right? Because who whose unconscious is it? It's yours, right? So all you're doing is kind of justifying and excusing your behaviors. But there is an element of I'm so wrapped up in this plan now, in this game now, I can't see a way out, and it feels too good that I don't want to get out anyway.
Yeah. And I agree. I think McKenna is right when she talks about what's really interesting is how much was conscious, and we can't really measure consciousness, but, let's say insight, right? And there were a couple times where I'm maybe a little ashamed to say, to be like, is that a delusion? But then I think, my delusional inmates who are so fascinating to me, I think delusional disorder is so fascinating without the other psychotic symptoms of like, I can't eat the food because it's being poisoned and the FBI chip in my brain and all that stuff. And Jody Hildebrandt didn't come off like that. So I agree with both of you. But actually, a psychologist that McKenna put me onto, I'm just going to read this because it's so appropriate. Jonathan Shedler. I sent him to you, John. He wrote the other day, one of the most important things I've learned, severe personality problems find camouflage. No one thinks I'm a sadist or I'm a malignant narcissist. They find a belief system, social group that validates their most hateful, destructive impulses and construes them as virtues. And I think that is spot on when it comes to Jody Hildebrandt. Although, I think most narcissists, psychopaths, do they have insight? Is it, I don't know. I think that has to be individualized, obviously, like everything. But to McKenna's point, Utah and the Mormon community was and Ruby Franke and her family was such a perfect, this is why I call it a perfect storm, was such a perfect place for her to capitalize. And her motives were vast: control, exploring potentially her sexuality, money, manipulation. I mean, there were so many benefits for her. Maybe even she enjoyed cruelty to children, sadism. That's again why I find her interesting, because I think she's multi-layered. She's more complex than meets the eye.
Next topic. All right, this is going to be Mac's topic. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Robert Hansen. So Robert Hansen was an FBI agent who was also selling secrets to the Soviets, and he had a long history of selling secrets. But you had us listen to a Wondery podcast about this case. Can you tell the audience a little bit more about kind of how everything unfolded and the interesting elements of Robert Hansen?
Yes. I can't remember if this was American Scandal or American History Tellers because it's the same host. They're both very good and have a
It was
narrative
Scandal.
format.
Yeah, it was
Okay.
Scandal.
Yes. Highly recommend. Love it. And I also love at the end of each one, they do an interview with someone that was either involved or has written about, researched it independently, etc. And so I was listening to this and was not really convinced that this was going to be compelling at all. But you have someone that is very into cyber crimes, and this was back in the day,
Yeah.
and is also specializing in studying the Soviet Union and is a staunch anti-communist. What was fascinating is this man abandoned his values to then essentially sell intelligence to the Soviet Union, which, by the way, led to not only, I mean, millions and millions of dollars in damage, but it cost people their lives. He outed spies that were kind of double agents. And it was interesting hearing the letters also that he wrote to them, where it's very clear that this isn't just purely transactional. He's really trying to win them over. He wants kind of, I don't know if it's validation, perhaps a connection, affection in some way. He wants to be acknowledged. And there's clearly a grievance that is festering over time because he keeps being bypassed for promotions, etc. And this is frustrating to him. They mentioned that he was really smart. He was he didn't have good social skills. And so that was part of the reason that he kept getting passed over and people were put off by him. It also sounds like he could kind of be hot-headed and unprofessional with people at times. And so it gets complicated because these government entities were not intersecting as much quite yet. So they were kind of assuming that this person, they knew that there was someone doing this. They assumed that it was in the other one. Like FBI thought it was CIA, CIA thought it was FBI, etc. It took them so long. There was some tunnel vision beyond that. And then when he's finally caught, I think he said something like, why, what took you so long or something. And so there's that element. And then there are also these random sex crimes that he's committing against his wife. And so there's also like this added layer. And so I wanted to toss that back to both of you. Number one, that what is that? How do we make sense of that in the context of this? And also, he kind of reminds me of the template that we might think of for targeted violence, and yet he went this route as opposed to like a physical violent route. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on those pieces about him, because it wasn't just someone ideologically and that aligned with his values, etc. But yeah, that he has these sort of layers to him.
Yeah, so for the audience, you should know that Dr. Lina Haji and I are both members of the Association for Threat Assessment Professionals. One of the bigger things in terms of threat assessment is insider threats, right? It's not necessarily, who's going to be the next school or workplace shooter. It is who is the next person that's going to engage in espionage, who's the next person that's going to engage in stealing secrets and stuff like that. So insider threats are also a thing to kind of evaluate, and law enforcement and mental health professionals are also taking a look at what is the different pathways for those people to engage in that behavior. And there is, when it comes to how do we also incorporate the deviant behaviors that he was engaging in, to include um, giving other parties sexual images of his wife. She said that she consented to, being the model in these images, but obviously they were never meant to, leave the relationship. And again, having taking these photos for your partner isn't wrong, right? If you've consented and both parties, that this it's appropriate, but it's uh, giving them to other people that he was engaging in, and then staging where this other third party would be able to watch them have sex. And I think it's important to realize that just because sex offenders aren't by themselves. Like they're not just a solo group of individuals that only ever engage in sexual misbehaviors. They also engage in other kinds of offending behaviors that kind of perpetuate and compel the other deviant behaviors, right? Everything is about kind of cycling through. For Hansen, it was this father wound that he could never truly be as good as his father was at anything, you know, led to him believing that the only way that he can make it in this world is if he gets, the affection from his father that he's never going to get, and he blames the world and he blames his father for not being able to get it. It becomes isolative, and he has this spouse that he only ever viewed as an object, right? She's described as the most beautiful person in that community. How does someone like Robert Hansen get a partner like her? So she's just a trophy, right? She's just an object. She's never who she is as a person, and she lives a life in which she believes that she should just you know give in to all of the whims of her husband, and is wanting to make a relationship work, and he's just using it as the next thing to kind of demonstrate that he has authority, that he is in control, not in the sense that we commonly think of power and control, but he wants to feel like a man. He wants to feel like I'm dominant, right? This nonsense alpha male bullshit that the algorithm keeps feeding, right? His this isn't new. This is all stuff that's been happening for generations. That in order to be a man, you have to dominate women, you have to make the most money, and you have to, you know, be whatever. And that further perpetuates him to go down this path to then, even though he says that he's a staunch anti-communist, he is a staunch, capitalist, right? Where he's more than willing to take their money's money, right? Right. And so doesn't matter what the money's coming from as long as he's getting it, because that's feeding, right, his deviancy. He's feeding this idea that he needs to have control. And so what's the best way for someone like him? It's to give secrets, because that's the thing that he has access to. He has access to information, and he understood that to be the most powerful thing. He could be any number of people. He just so happened to be an FBI agent with access.
Yeah. And I think when McKenna has literally never steered me wrong on a documentary or a podcast. Actually, I hold her accountable for the amount of time that I spent on podcasts. But when I first started listening to this, I was like, what? Why did she send me this? This is not interesting. There's no dead bodies. There's no, and then within 5 minutes, I texted her, this wasn't about money. This was not about money. And she was like, bingo, come back to me when you listen to more. Right. And I agree with you, John, that there, money was an added bonus, but like, he's having what, 4, 5,
Mhm.
6 kids. He's complaining he has no money, but that it wasn't about that. And then when McKenna said like this guy's levels of narcissism, and I'm ashamed to say that initially I didn't pick up on that. I really didn't pick up on the narcissism. I saw the entitlement when he kept getting passed over for promotions that he thought were absolutely had to come to him. And then the resentment of like, do you guys remember when they talked about his friends going out for happy hour and he was never invited? Like this growing perceived slight, or maybe, true slight, but he had no social skills. And so, but he wasn't willing to take accountability for that at all. There was no accountability anywhere. I thought it was also very interesting when he got caught and said, what took you guys so long? Also, I'm going to digress a little bit only because I took a long time to understand the difference between a threat assessment and a violence risk assessment.
Yeah.
Not proud of that. But yeah, thank you, John, for helping me with threat assessment, because I didn't understand And I don't think a lot of people do understand the difference between a threat assessment and a violence risk assessment. And I've done a lot of violence risk assessments, the HCR 20 and the sexual violence risk assessments. And those are more taking into account risk factors and mitigating factors that somebody will engage in future violence. Whereas a threat assessment is more what you talked about, John, the odds of a particular threat being carried out. Please correct me if I'm not.
Yeah, it's we're I mean, we are looking at different behaviors, but with a risk assessment, we already know that the person is capable of engaging
Yes.
in the violent act, right? We're looking at whether or not this person is going to engage in a subsequent violent act. With a threat assessment, we're looking at, you know, this person has said that they are capable of doing something.
Right.
Are
There's a
they actually capable of doing that thing? Um, or something similar, right? Because depending on, kind of who we're being asked to do this for, um, so like an example would be, someone has said, someone told another female employee, a male told another female employee that he's going to shoot up the place, right? To shoot up the workplace. Okay, but isn't it also possible that, he might commit an act of violence against her, right? So can, is this person capable of engaging in any threat, right? Whatever the threat may be. Sometimes it's actually, declared. Sometimes it's, when we're talking about an insider threat, uh, we're looking at, is this person capable of engaging in an act of, deception, an act of violence, and an act of anything that would be a detriment to the agency, the company, whoever. CIA is usually pretty good about, doing that kind of work. They spend a lot of time, kind of identifying what are insider threats they need to, right? Because it's, as we saw, it's kind of super easy. If the person is interested in selling you secrets, it's kind of easy to get them to do so. Um, and so kind of want to watch out for that. And so it's really just about, here's this guy who has all of these outward presenting features about who he is as an FBI agent, when in reality he's completely destroying everything that he claims to hold dear. One of the other elements, the interesting elements, is that his wife was a member of Opus Dei. I think a lot of people are they know about Opus Dei from Dan Brown, and his books about uh, symbolism and symbology, right? But as a Catholic, they really are kind of very extreme in their beliefs about stuff, and he's also kind of denigrating those pillars as well. Like, this guy is so willing to abandon all that he claims to be are his virtues,
Mhm.
that when you look at him from a game theory perspective, he's engaging in the Moloch game, which is, for those that don't know, we'll do a kind of simple. Moloch was this demon negative entity in Judaism, in which, again, I'm simplifying this, in which different tribes would, offer their children to Moloch in order to ensure victory in battle. And in game theory, it's used to say that it's a race to the bottom. How much of your virtues, how much are you willing to kind of sacrifice in order to ensure that you win? And for Robert Hansen, winning meant that he was on top no matter what, right? That, he makes his wife do whatever he wants, and he's going to show the FBI just how smart he is, and how wrong they were to pass him up. And even though he's anti-communist, right, he's more than willing to cash their checks. And so for him, just tossing away all of what he claims these virtues to be, makes someone like that very dangerous. And I'm surprised more people closer to him did not end up dead.
Mhm.
Um,
Mm.
But, what ended up happening instead of physical violence was uh, sexual violence, where he exploited his wife in ways that, you know, he should not have done.
Two
I
things
don't,
that
sorry, go ahead, McKenna.
I was just going to say, two things that stood out to me about that was number one, this was in a time when you, at least when you first started, you needed to snail mail things.
Yeah.
And I remember texting Lena the level of effort that this man went through to do these things. So he had these printed, developed photos of his wife and then took those. It's not today where that's a lot easier to access and do mechanically, systematically, all that stuff. Like the effort he went to, that stood out to me. And in general, the level of effort that he went to, obviously on the, I guess, the quote unquote white collar crime piece. The other piece, though, is John, what you mentioned. He didn't take the physical violence route toward the workplace when if he's not feeling man enough, that
Mhm.
stands out to me. It's so interesting that he didn't go shoot up the workplace to prove it. I mean, he used his gun. They needed to. And in fact, that was one of the ways that the undercover agent got access to his Palm Pilot is they were challenging him to a competition to basically going to shoot at the range. He had access to a gun, and instead of meeting people where they are in terms of what he thought they believed, like he's not man enough and what he wanted to prove, he didn't go that route. He still went the route he normally would take in terms of intelligence instead of this physical violence, which I think is really interesting because it sounds like he has some of those traits that we might unfortunately see with someone that might then go along that pathway of violence to physical violence towards someone else and that more targeted violence instead of meeting people where they were to prove how manly or physically strong he was. He went the route that was easiest for him.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to one of the different elements of from Bandura's social learning theory, which is you have to actually be physically capable of engaging in the act that you're witnessing. And Robert Hansen isn't exactly, you know, like he's not Conor McGregor, right? He's not, going to be engaging in a UFC fight. Like I think there's also, for the audience to remember that sometimes you do the things because you know that you can do them,
Mhm.
right? Like he knew he could take photos of his wife. He knew that he could manipulate and exploit her. So why not just push that further? He knew he couldn't throw a punch. I mean, yes, he's trained in the FBI, so they do some boxing. Obviously, he's supposed to be able to run a little bit, but he's not the physically in shape, imposing figure. He's a big, tall guy, sure, but he's not the imposing physical figure. So instead, for him, his mind, he thinks is the most powerful weapon that he has, more powerful than any other person's mind is around him. And so, from a social learning theory, he can't is not capable of mimicking the behaviors that he sees of other men. So let me do something different instead.
But you know what's interesting about him is, he claimed all these virtues, right? I don't think he cared about any of those. I don't think he was a staunch anti-communist. I don't think he really cared about his wife or children at all. But impression management was still a big, or however you want to label it. Impression management, he had the wife, he had the respectable job. I mean, everybody wants to be an FBI agent. He had the house, he had the kids, he had all of that. So what struck me, honestly, was when he got arrested and he said, "What took you guys so long?" What do you guys make of that? What do you guys make of that? Why do you think he was just kind of gave up? Was it more like an FU and like, haha, I've been doing this for so long and clearly I'm smarter than you? Or was it like, what do you guys make of that? The fact that, he was big on impressions and presenting a certain way. And he presented well, apparently. I mean, he got people to trust him and stuff like that. And he had all the things I listed. I was a little taken aback when he was just like, here's my confession. What took you so long? What do you think?
Mac?
I remember they kind of were saying that he was worried about getting caught and then still kept doing it. In a way, it kind of reminded me of people that are committing fraud, and there's still this drive and impulse that even if they know they might get caught, they're feeling more stressed out. And I guess however we feel stressed out, we're going to do the thing perhaps even more. It's, similarly probably on the violence side. If someone's
Or
experiencing a
drug
life
dealer.
stressor,
Or drug
right,
dealer.
right. Are you going to do the thing more, even though like it might put you more at risk? Obviously, there's something different being driven here. And it is interesting, though, a paradox of he simultaneously thought that he was smarter than all of them, but also wondered, how did it take you guys this long to find me? But I do remember him kind of engaging in the more desperate, impulsive behaviors that did remind me of someone perhaps committing fraud and they know someone's on their tail, and instead of backing off and shifting to something else, they keep doing the thing because it seems like there's this drive here for him, perhaps differently, maybe similarly, in terms of getting, that validation, or maybe he knew at some point perhaps it was inevitable. I think they even described him, whether or not that was something he said, this it was the feeling that he got, Lena, to your point, like it wasn't all the money, it was the feeling that he got from it. And so there's this almost like compulsive nature to the behavior, it sounded like, to me anyway.
Yeah, I agree. I don't view it as a kind of taunt. I do think he was legitimately concerned. What took you so long? I think whether or not people want to describe it this way, especially the narcissist, especially the psychopath. I think that's another element that I think some people get that is misunderstood. Even the psychopath feels feelings. They just don't
Mhm.
feel feelings the way a typical person does. And a little guilt goes a long way. I think he was legitimately waiting.
Yeah.
And because, and I think there's another element of when it doesn't happen as fast as you think it should happen, you get upset, you get angry. And so then it makes you want to engage in it more. And then when
Mm.
it finally happens, you're like, man, like I've, it's not like I was, wearing a mask this whole time. Like you guys could have, if it were me, I would have caught me a lot sooner than you guys caught me now. So I don't think it was a taunt so much as it was finally a relief that the emotional discharge of the feelings of guilt and shame that he had been suppressing for so long can finally be expelled. And the physical behavior of having handcuffs put on you and you being put in jail and all of those things are kind of, he can finally in a sense exhale, right, instead of
Yeah,
just
it's
kind
kind of
of.
like when serial killers are like, stop me, please
Yeah,
catch me. And people don't buy that. But I think there have to be at least one or two or many serial killers who mean that. Like, please catch me because I'm not going to
I
stop.
think, yeah, I think it's more likely that a serial killer is wanting the person to legitimately stop them as opposed to a taunt for police
Right.
try to
Right.
stop me. I think most people most people don't want to kill another person, right? They don't want that's not something that is inherent to who we are. And so I think most times if the serial killer is reaching out, they legitimately want you to stop them as opposed to, the taunting element of come on and try to stop me where they're trying to create, the world's greatest crime spree or whatever that nonsense is. I think most times the guilt and shame um, wants them to wants someone to stop them because if they could do it themselves, they wouldn't have done it from the beginning.
It is interesting too if we contrast him with Hildebrandt, whereas it sounds like these defenses, drives, whatever you want to call them, for him are not as strong, intact, entrenched in him. There is this difference, this clash perhaps between the values that not only maybe he gives other people, but he might believe himself. I believe he was also Catholic or
Hmm.
Christian.
Well, yeah,
And
he converted to Opus Dei Catholicism. Yeah.
right. And I think he confessed. So there are at least some moments where he breaks from the behavior and he's not fully believing everything that he's doing. Whereas I don't know that someone like Hildebrand would have a similar experience of a conscious, that internal struggle or that internal conflict. Those defenses maybe are so strong and in place that there isn't as much conflict internally.
And strictly from a Dr. Hare perspective, I think Hildebrandt would have scored higher on the PCLR than Hansen.
I
Maybe I'm
agree. Yeah,
right,
no,
but I think Hildebrandt would have scored higher.
yeah. No, I agree. I definitely agree with that.
Yeah.
All right. But Dr. Lina Haji, Dr. McKenna Hereford, thank you very much for joining me, Dr. John Dolatorre, the Texas Psychologist podcast. Like, subscribe, rate, everything, please, to help promote the podcast. And thank you very much.